Welcome to History in One Take. In this series, we explore the rise of the Vikings, their fortresses, their journeys, and the events that shaped the early medieval world. Today, we begin a new chapter, the first Viking raids on England, a period that transformed the British Isles and marked the beginning of more than 2 centuries of conflict, settlement, and cultural change. This is the story of how a distant people, driven by opportunity, ambition, and the sea, arrived on England's shores and changed its history forever. In the late 8th century, England was a land divided into several kingdoms. Northumbria ruled the north, Mercia dominated the center, Wessex held the south, and smaller realms like Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia filled the spaces between. These kingdoms were Christian, organized, and deeply connected to the monasteries that preserved learning, wealth, and culture. Monasteries were not only religious centers, they were repositories of books, gold, silver, and precious objects. They were places of peace, protected by faith rather than walls. But across the North Sea, in Scandinavia, a different world was taking shape. The Norse lived in a landscape of fjords, forests, and scattered settlements. They were skilled sailors, traders, and warriors. Their ships were masterpieces of engineering, long, narrow vessels that could cross oceans, navigate rivers, and land on beaches without harbors. These ships gave the Vikings mobility that no other people in Europe possessed. They could appear suddenly, strike quickly, and vanish before defenders could respond. And sometime around the year 793, they turned their attention westward. The first recorded Viking raid on England took place at Lindisfarne, a small island off the coast of Northumbria. Lindisfarne was famous for its monastery, a center of learning and devotion founded by Saint Aidan. On a summer day in 793, longships appeared on the horizon. The monks had no reason to fear the sea, but the ships that approached were unlike anything they had seen. Sleek, fast, and silent, they carried warriors armed with axes, spears, and shields. The Vikings landed, stormed the monastery, and unleashed a level of violence that shocked the Christian world. They killed, captured, and plundered, taking gold, silver, and sacred objects. The raid was so brutal that chroniclers described it as a sign of divine punishment, a warning that the world was changing. Lindisfarne was not an isolated attack. It was the beginning of a pattern. In the years that followed, Viking ships struck other monasteries along the coast, Jarrow, Wearmouth, and Iona. These places were wealthy, undefended, and filled with treasures. The Vikings understood that monasteries were easy targets. They were not attacking Christianity itself. They were attacking opportunity. The raids were fast, precise, and devastating. They revealed a new kind of threat, one that England's kingdoms were not prepared to face. By the early 9th century, Viking raids had become more frequent. The Norse were learning the geography of the British Isles, mapping coastlines, rivers, and settlements. They discovered that England's wealth was not limited to monasteries. Towns, farms, and trading ports offered resources that could be taken quickly. The Vikings also realized that England's kingdoms were divided. Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex often fought each other, leaving gaps in their defenses. The Vikings exploited these weaknesses, striking where resistance was weakest. The raids grew bolder. Vikings sailed up rivers like the Thames, the Humber, and the Tyne, reaching deep into the interior. They attacked towns such as London, Canterbury, and Rochester. These raids were not just about plunder. They were tests, experiments to see how far they could push, how quickly they could strike, and how England would respond. The answer was clear. England was vulnerable. The Vikings were not only raiders. They were traders, explorers, and settlers. Some came for wealth, others for land. As the raids continued, the Norse began to establish temporary camps along the coast. These camps allowed them to stay longer, raid further, and return home with greater riches. The English kingdoms tried to resist, but their armies were small and often slow to mobilize. Viking ships could appear and disappear before defenders even knew they were coming. By the mid-9th century, the raids had become a regular part of life in England. Chroniclers wrote of heathen men arriving year after year, bringing fire and destruction. But something was changing. The Vikings were no longer content with quick strikes. They were beginning to stay longer, to explore deeper, and to consider the possibility of something more permanent. The raids were evolving into something larger, something that would reshape England entirely. The turning point came in 865, when a massive Viking force arrived in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party. It was an army. Known later as the Great Heathen Army, it marked the beginning of a new phase in Viking activity: conquest. The first raids had opened the door. The Great Heathen Army would walk through it. But before the army came, the raids had already changed England. They had revealed weaknesses in the kingdoms, exposed the vulnerability of monasteries, and demonstrated the power of Viking mobility. They had created fear, a fear that spread through towns, villages, and churches. And they had shown that the Vikings were not a passing threat. They were a force that could shape the future. The first Viking raids were not random acts of violence. They were the beginning of a long and complex relationship between Scandinavia and England, a relationship built on conflict, trade, settlement, and eventually, kingship. The Vikings would become part of England's story, shaping its history in ways that still echo today. Thank you for watching History in One Take. If you enjoyed this beginning to the Viking invasion of England, then subscribe to the channel. It helps this project grow and ensures you don't miss the next chapter in the story.